Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor to serve as director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you to another of our Zoom programs. We've done many over these last 15 months. We're coming inevitably to our summer hiatus, but we're hoping to come back in the fall, you should all know, with a combination of live and Zoom programs that hybrid program that I'm sure you've been hearing about that will be governing most of our lives in the first few months of the fall. Before we start today, I want to express on behalf of Hunter and Roosevelt House our deep sympathies at the news of the passing of one of the most respected and revered, really, members of the Roosevelt House Board of Advisors, the former chief judge and currently senior judge of the U.S. Circuit Court for the Second District, Judge Robert Katzman, who passed away yesterday, much, much too young. We're all particularly grieving with his family at this tremendous loss. And might be worth noting here, 10 days into Pride Month, that Bob Katzman was the chief when the Second Circuit ruled in its famous Zarda decision, which was then appealed to the US Supreme Court and became the springboard for marriage equality. So thank you to Bob and for all that he did for Roosevelt House and for the rest of this big Second Circuit and for the rest of the country. On a happier note, we're happy to welcome to our event tonight Phoebe Roosevelt and Grace Roosevelt. It's always wonderful to welcome members of the Roosevelt family to one of our programs, and we thank them for joining. And it's a particular joy to welcome back to our Zoom programs another of our revered board members, Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel, who is one of our leading experts on all things Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. So welcome, Bill. Again, we're glad that you stayed with us online this year and hope that you're looking forward to coming back to Roosevelt House in person. Tonight is a perfect bridge for that transition because it talks about the book that we're discussing tonight, explores the past and applies the lessons of the past to the future, very subtly, I might add. So we're both examining history and using history to inform policy. The book is Why the New Deal Matters, and I'm delighted to welcome its author, Dr. Eric Rauchway, who is a distinguished professor of history at the University of California, Davis, and the author of such previous books as The Moneymakers, How Roosevelt and Keynes Ended the Depression, Defeated Fascism, and Secured a Prosperous Peace, and another title, Winter War, Hoover, Roosevelt, and the First Clash over the New Deal. These projects have clearly inspired Professor Rauchway's engaging new approach to the New Deal era. The book shows in a series of, not to oversimplify, but a series of visits to places impacted by the New Deal, illuminates how FDR's domestic initiatives changed the face of America and changed Americans' relationship with and expectations of their government. As you'll hear this evening, though you might easily read this book as a very delightful travelogue, its fundamental impact is to demonstrate how much our lives, almost 90 years after these programs began rolling out, are so deeply impacted by Roosevelt and his reforms. So tonight we'll hear how the New Deal changed the nation and its people, its safety net, its infrastructure, introducing new expectations and new technologies, how the New Deal succeeded, where it came up a bit short, and how the heck FDR did it all. I know he had a big majority in Congress, but there are some lessons to be learned there. New York isn't on your itinerary, Eric, but I think our audience knows that our city is filled with evidence of why the New Deal matters. Swimming pools, which have just opened for the summer season, public housing, post office murals, high schools. I went to a WPA designed cookie cutter high school, subway lines, the FDR Drive, the Triborough Bridge, not to mention the 65th Street Transverse, which I somehow think Roosevelt built to annoy his mother with the traffic for the rest of her life on 65th Street. And Hunter College's own North Building, which was dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt himself. So tell us why you decided, as you put it, to tour the New Deal in space and time, and particularly why now?
Well, I think that we know, first of all, thank you for that very gracious introduction and for your kind words, and I'm very glad to be here. I think a lot of us know, as you've suggested, that there are New Deal landmarks near us. And I think quite often think about the New Deal as something whose legacy we could visit. We know that there's a school or a post office or a highway or a bridge or something that is close by that, was put there by the New Deal. And I think, if we think a bit further, we also know that there are elements of the New Deal that are still part and parcel of our political system in the United States today. But I wanted to emphasize really the New Deal's ubiquity and its vitality in ways that even those kinds of observations don't really do justice to. We know that if we do almost anything economic at all in the United States today, whether it's buy a house, join a union, open a bank account, buy something on the stock market, or in fact, even handle a dollar bill, we're using institutions that were established during Roosevelt's presidency and were part and parcel of the New Deal. But I think we don't quite appreciate how the very landscape that we live in very fundamental ways, was shaped by the New Deal, which gave us the first modern national road network, which gave us not only parks and public spaces, but sidewalks, which ended the 19th century practices of giving away public lands, whether by the Homestead Act or by dividing up Indian reservations, and instead instituted policies to put those lands in some kind of federal or native nation trust. Right, that the very land that we live on, which was also regulated by institutions like the TVA, which had a proto-ecological consciousness, right, tells us something about how we are living in a physical land that was put there by the New Deal and is shaped by the New Deal. And I think that's the reason why it's useful to talk about it now, that the original New Deal was a program to allow Americans to develop a more sustainable way of living on that land, and also to illustrate to Americans that our government, that our democracy, as admittedly flawed as it was and remains, right, was a lot better than the available alternatives in 1933. We have to remember that the Depression was not just an economic crisis, but it was a crisis of democracy. And that for Franklin Roosevelt and other New Dealers, that was really the most important function of the New Deal, was to restore Americans' ability to believe in democracy.
Yeah, I was fascinated about a thread that ran through the book in that vein. And that is that the New Deal was kind of a bulwark against fascism, and that Roosevelt saw that proving that the institutions of democracy could confront an economic crisis had more than a restorative economic impact. And so comment on that, and also the notion, the corollary notion that you explore, that the New Deal gave Americans a sense of, maybe for the first time, common purpose in a national effort that was not a war.
Right. I think that, it is striking that most of the ways that we hark back to moments that America pulled together, it is about destructive purpose. And the New Deal, conversely, is a nationally unifying effort that is literally constructive and has literally concrete legacies. There's these metaphors sort of fall in on themselves, right? Because they are so much actually emphasizing what the New Deal built for Americans. In 1933, when between the time Roosevelt was elected and took office for the first time is when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And this was, for Franklin Roosevelt particularly, as well as many other observers, a real harbinger of doom, right, for Europe and a sign of alarm even for the United States, because Roosevelt believed that Nazism posed an existential threat to democracy, that it simply couldn't exist in the same world with the rule of law and with democratic regimes. And so he understood the nature of that threat, and he also understood the appeal of right-wing movements, of potential Nazi-style movements or actual Nazi influence within the United States right from the beginning. Right? He stressed very clearly that this was what the New Deal must deliver, was an illustration that the American government as it existed could still work. Shortly after he was elected, a friend of his said to him, you know, if you make this work, you will be remembered as one of the best of American presidents. If you don't make it work, you will be remembered as one of the worst. And Roosevelt replied, if I don't make it work, I will be the last. Right? That there was a very clear sense in his mind that democracy was teetering on a knife edge in the United States as elsewhere in the world, and that what the New Deal must do was not betray the hopes that he had raised in his campaign, but deliver on them in ways that Americans could look at and point to and say, this is what we've done for ourselves.
And if you revisit some of those campaign speeches beginning at the convention, they rail against the banks and the privileged in a way that probably no candidate from a mainstream party has done in the last 90 years. And you write that in delivering on that kind of a radicalized promise of shifting the balance of, if not both power and emphasis in America, that Roosevelt doesn't quite get enough credit for what he did to shift power from corporations and banks to government, and that's kind of a lasting assumption of that extraordinary revolution.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that Roosevelt doesn't get quite enough credit, although people may feel that he gets quite enough credit for everything. But that these ideas were part of the New Deal from the very beginning. As you say, at the convention in 1932, Roosevelt explained why a politics of reaction would lead to the overthrow of American institutions. He went on to say repeatedly in his inaugural address, specifically that the money changers have now been driven from the temple and we must replace that with our democratic creed. He goes on to say in the following year to acknowledge that some toes will be stepped on and that people whose toes are being stepped on are just going to have to live with it. Right? This is from the very beginning, and it remains a hallmark of the New Deal, in part because he was confident that the vast majority of the American electorate were with him in this democratization of the country, something that he called for again in 1936 at the Democratic Convention at Philadelphia, where he said, this is going to be for us a moment that is similar to 1776, that we are going to give people a democracy in which people not only have enough to live on, but have something to live for. Right? That there was democracy as an affirmative ideal, as something that was progressive, that was getting better as you went.
And you say, by the way, Eric, I love when you say, I think you're right. I've learned all this from you, just saying, but that's okay. I'm glad I'm now correct, but I give you credit for everything. You say in the book, and I'm going to quote you specifically, and it's in a follow-up to what you just said, that the New Deal, your argument is that it did improve democracy within the United States. So at a moment in which many people believe that democracy is in danger, especially voting rights in certain states, is the improvement of how permanent and how marked was that improvement that the New Deal brought about?
Well, nothing is permanent, as we have seen in this Vale of Tears or in this imperfect nation, and many of the marks of progress that began in the 1930s and continues through the 40s into the 60s have been rolled back. I think we all know that, and we could talk about that maybe a bit later. But I think that one of the most important things to remember about the New Deal and democracy is that even though when Roosevelt came to office, the Democratic Party was still very much the party of Jim Crow in the South, and those large majorities in Congress that you refer to depended on Southern congressmen and particularly senators who were opposed to many elements of the New Deal. Even though that was true, Roosevelt's administration won over Black voters, right? That with the New Deal, with the implementation of the New Deal, specifically with the Works Progress Administration, which was run by Harry Hopkins directly out of Washington and had anti-discrimination measures built into it from the beginning, eventually as a matter of law, Black people had work opportunities in America that they otherwise wouldn't have had and became Democrats as a consequence. Right? It's not in 1932 that a majority of Black voters vote for FDR. It's in 1936, after the New Deal has become clear in what it's going to be and how it's going to work. And it's in Roosevelt's second term that his administration really acknowledges that by establishing within the Department of Justice a civil rights section, which will later become the Civil Rights Division, which is charged with enforcing civil rights for all Americans, including Black Americans, and whose first real Supreme Court case is about voting rights. Right? So we can sort of put a marker there and say this is the beginning of the Democratic Party becoming the national party of civil rights, becoming the party that Black Americans can rely on more than others. Again, despite its many acknowledged failures and still also being the party of Jim Crow in the South, nevertheless undermining its own strengths there and pressing forward with an agenda of democracy. I think that's something that we could point to in terms of inspirational leadership.
It's always been one of my joys in my 6 years focused on Franklin Roosevelt to remind viewers from time to time, based on my own expertise, how conscious FDR was of employing Abraham Lincoln as his very own. Woodrow Wilson had tried, but without quite the conviction of FDR. And even when he was governor, he talked about using Lincoln to get African-American voters to switch their allegiance from the Republicans to the Democrats. And he, I've traced comments all through his first 4 or 5 years as president when he continues to focus on that. And then, of course, he hires Robert Emmett Sherwood shortly after Sherwood wins a Pulitzer for Abe Lincoln in Illinois to join his speechwriting staff to bring Lincoln in again, this time as a validation for fighting wars that may seem, not totally necessary. He has setting up, Lincoln is to set up a war against fascism before Pearl Harbor made it inevitable. Anyway, just had to throw in Abraham Lincoln there.
It's worked perfectly well. I mean, as it was already clear by 1933 that the Republican Party was no longer the party of Lincoln in many respects, and Roosevelt expected to capitalize.
It died hard, as you point out. It's remarkable, right, that the Black vote was majority for Herbert Hoover after the Depression hit people of color harder than whites. So it's, and now, of course, the bedrock Democratic vote wasn't always thus. But let's stay on what you said about the Dixiecrats and their crucial support for New Deal programs. So how do we accept that without being critical of Roosevelt, say, and I will use a provocative tone here, caving in on providing Social Security benefits for domestic workers, sharecroppers, which is what the Dixiecrats wanted?
I don't think there's any reason to refrain from being critical of Roosevelt. I think it's perfectly fine to be critical of Roosevelt. I think the figure whose sort of tone I think is and whose substance is worth pointing to here is the economist Robert Weaver, who was a Black economist who came into the New Deal very early in 1933. He would later be the first Black cabinet official in American history in the Lyndon Johnson administration. And Weaver says, quite frankly, when thinking about these years, that Roosevelt was not a great civil rights president, but he was a great president, nevertheless. And of course, Weaver spent a lot of time working for the administration, making it a better administration for civil rights and a better administration for Black Americans. And as Weaver pointed out, Roosevelt always had priorities. The first was getting New Deal measures through so that he could show that he could restore the economy by keeping democratic institutions intact. And that was his first priority. So when, as you say, Dixiecrat senators or proto-Dixiecrat senators said that they were going to filibuster against the proposed federal anti-lynching bill, which had passed by the House of Representatives, Roosevelt gave in, right, rather than have his legislative agenda held up. And that was true even later in the 1930s when his agenda shifted towards preparing the nation for war against the Nazis. That was the thing that the Southern senators could threaten to hold up. So Roosevelt had those two priorities, which were for recovery from the Depression and preparation for war, and he put them ahead of pressing forward with civil rights. Now, to me, looking at the political landscape in the 1930s, and indeed listening to Democrats even today, the remarkable thing is not that Roosevelt didn't press harder for civil rights, it's that he pressed it all. Right? We've seen many Democrats do far less, even in a time when the black vote is even more important to the Democratic Party than it was then.
And many of the people on screen with us and online with us this evening may remember that we did an extraordinary program on a book about the Black Cabinet, so-called, the group of assistant and deputy secretaries who convened with Mary McLeod Bethune and tried to push priorities for Black people into New Deal programs. And that's an extraordinary story on its own. And of course, Eleanor was their champion and their hero through the war. We actually had some descendants of the Black Cabinet on with us, including a descendant of Secretary Weaver. It was quite a moving show. So that legacy has been burned bright. And just to digress for one more second, those of you who are interested in that discussion following this one, you need only go on the Roosevelt House website and you can see it for yourselves, descendants included. So Eric, back to you on an issue that I thought you were particularly convincing about. You mentioned that during a lockdown, during a pandemic, the New Deal attained new relevance, even if people didn't always point to it in their desperation and understandable panic. And that is the isolated elderly could count on old age pensions. Displaced workers could rely on unemployment insurance. Those who were dependent on their savings didn't have to worry that their savings would be depleted in a bank failure because of the FDIC, all byproducts of the New Deal and all kind of accepted as almost part of the American founding by this point. It reminds me of a sign that was held up in not this campaign, maybe not since 2008, but someone held up a sign saying, stop socialism, hands off my Medicare. People forget that these are national programs that come out of presidential administrations. So FDR also talked about healthcare. And that's something he never achieved. Why was it elusive for him? Did we lose one great shining moment of possibility when that would not have become a political hot potato for 9 decades?
Well, I mean, this is another moment where Roosevelt put other priorities first. I mean, to sort of set the stage, right? We're thinking about 1935 now and the passage of the original Social Security Act, as well as the creation of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and a number of other sort of the second wave of New Deal legislation after the first New Deal of 1933. So how did that come about? Well, first of all, the first 100 days was a success, right? That Roosevelt's monetary policy, his recovery policy from the earliest part of 1933 helped to spur rapid economic recovery in that first year and a bit of his administration. And indeed, recovery would continue rapidly right through his first term, up until the recession, in fact, of 1937-38. We're talking about 8, 9, 10% annual economic growth and precipitous drops in unemployment. So his policies were rapidly passed, and they were materially successful, and people could see that. And as you know, therefore, in the congressional elections of 1934, the Democrats won even larger majorities than previously they had. And the reaction to that among the New Dealers was, this is the moment to get everything we can get. Right. This is what Harry Hopkins famously told his staff at one of his many trips to the racetrack after that election, which was, this is it, boys. This is our chance, right? We're going to get everything we can possibly get. And so this is when the Committee on Economic Security sort of churns through its reports and comes back to Roosevelt with all manner of recommendations for how to implement old age pensions, unemployment insurance, a national federal works program, what we would today call a jobs guarantee, although that got whittled back right at the time in 1935. And the program for Social Security didn't just include old age pensions. It also included, as we've said, unemployment insurance, sort of basic insurance for mothers with dependent children, also sort of basic rudimentary disability coverage. And there was a proposal for federalized health care. And Roosevelt, among others, but most notably Roosevelt, believed it was not the time to press for that. Now, they got all manner of things, right? They got almost every other thing that they thought that they were going to get, even if it wasn't quite on the scale. As you said, Social Security, old age pensions were limited from the start, in a way that they were limited in other countries, but that had a particular racial skew in the United States because of structural and systemic racism in the United States. And the Works Progress Administration ended up being a lot smaller than its proponents had wanted it to be, right? They had to deal with those things. Roosevelt's calculation was it was better to get this major program rather than to strive for a perfect program. Social Security old age pensions would be improved even during Roosevelt's own presidency, and again revisited at several times over history and expanded and during the Eisenhower years, right? So there was always opportunity to improve things once they were there and people were committed to them. That was Roosevelt's approach. As to whether he could have pushed for more, there are many issues on which we could ask that. As you know, healthcare came around again with Truman. It was possibly in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon eras. And it wasn't until much later that we finally got a much bigger swing at it, a focused swing at it. And as you know, even in the 1990s, it went down to defeat. So it's hard to say necessarily that Roosevelt was wrong to sort of shelve it. But he generally understood that he should push for what he could get, and as big a piece of what he could get as he could get when he could get it. And that was one of his calculations.
So our audience loves its Roosevelt history, especially connected to Roosevelt House, which we'll get to in a moment. But I want to ask you to talk a little bit about something you say in your book, which is that FDR may well have been the candidate that Herbert Hoover most wanted to run against among the Democratic aspirants in 1932. Was that because Hoover perceived him as the most radical, or because of his physical disability? He thought it made him seem too weak to be president, or both?
It was both. It was both. This comes from internal documents, diaries, and letters and journals from Hoover aides during the 1932 campaign. It's very clear that really from the beginning that Hoover thought Roosevelt was the person he would rather run against than any of the more conservative Democrats, because he thought they would pose a threat to him. And here Roosevelt was identified because of his successful governorship and the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, particularly with a, if you like, radical and aggressive response to the Depression. And that was what Hoover wanted to run against. He wanted to run against somebody who he could paint as taking the nation on the road to Moscow. And in fact, that's how Hoover ran, right, against Roosevelt as a dangerous radical who was going to usher in socialism and then communism. Right? So he wanted to run against Roosevelt for those reasons. It's also quite clear that both he and his aides thought of Roosevelt as probably weak, physically weak, right? They thought of the presidency as a kind of endurance project that Hoover, with his, sort of durable physique, could put up with, and that lesser men could not. And they thought of Roosevelt in that way, right? They were reflecting, of course, some of the prejudices of their time. In some respects, they went beyond the prejudices of their time in ascribing mental weakness to Roosevelt to go along with his physical weakness. So they believed that this was the guy that they wanted to run against, and they believed that that was going to be their best shot at winning.
And of course, there was the medicine ball strategy that could continue on that path. But suddenly Hoover was tossing a medicine ball around. I don't know if many viewers even know what a medicine ball is anymore. It's a very heavy ball that's supposed to be a workout to toss it back and forth. Suddenly there he was exercising on the lawn of the White House to demonstrate his physical activity. But Eric, don't you think there was a little bit of, and we hear the same thing today about press bias. So, but the press did not cover Roosevelt's disability in a major probing way, nor, of course, as we've discussed many times at the House, did they allow, by gentleman's agreement for a while until the war, allow photographs of, permit themselves to take photographs of Roosevelt struggling to propel himself on his braces. We have a picture in the, I wish I could show it to you, and I hope I will someday, a big picture in our hallway vestibule as you walk into Roosevelt House of FDR maneuvering down the steps of Roosevelt House on a visit in 1933. And he is holding onto a railing that was evidently there for his use. And it was taken by a Daily News photographer as an exclusive, but the editors declined to publish it simply because the steel brace around his leg, the stirrup of it, showed under his shoe as he stepped forward. So that's a remarkable degree of protection. So was there, the press was on Roosevelt's side is what I'm trying to say, which is fine with me. I'm just mentioning it.
I mean, I think it's true that
Not the editors, not the publishers, excuse me.
Roosevelt's disabilities weren't pried into in a way that I rather suspect they would be today during his presidency and even during the campaign. At the same time, and it's also worth pointing that in 1932, the Depression was so bad, with near 25% unemployment, with most of those people who had jobs having only part-time employment, with commodity prices, having plummeted so that farmers couldn't, profitably harvest their et cetera, that most papers really weren't that keen on preserving Hoover in the presidency, even habitually Republican papers in 1932. But it's also worth pointing out that many of those papers spun on a dime and began attacking Roosevelt quite viciously within the first year or so of his presidency. That the Tribune paper, the Chicago Tribune under Colonel McCormick, was one of his earliest and most energetic opponents. So were all of the Hearst papers. Hearst had, a media empire that was analogous to something like Fox today, with a presence in all media, movies, newsreels, newspapers, radio, right? Even by the end of the decade, the Daily News had turned against Roosevelt. So they didn't go after him for being disabled, but they went after him for pretty much everything else.
Well, I know when I was researching my book on the presidents and the press, I found more than one occasion, even in his own 998 news conferences, where he railed against the publishers who never, by a majority, endorsed him editorially for president, not in any of his 4 terms, not even in 1936. And that really irritated him. Of course, the Tribune sent a photographer to get a picture of him struggling, and the other photographers managed to give him a jostle just at the right time until he learned that if he wanted to be in the photography corps, he had to play by their rules, which was just fascinating. I want to ask, before we go back to the New Deal itself. You made there was such a great analog in your book. I worry that the Department of the Interior has squelched it to some degree, although I'm not sure I believe all of their report on Lafayette Square. But when I was reading your account of Hoover and MacArthur breaking up the bonus army. I've thought a great deal about Lafayette Square and the overreaction to the crowds there. Did you see that parallel as you were writing?
You know, I didn't, because I actually wrote that before that.
Okay,
And, you know, as the book was already in press, you know, the January 6th episode happened, and that was put another gloss on that. I mean, you know, it just, and this is in the first chapter of the book where I started in Arlington National Cemetery, trying to sort of set the stage for the New Deal again there, as you say, in space and time. And in 1932, you had these tens of thousands of veterans come to Washington, D.C., first to lobby for relief, right, from the Congress for some kind of bill, what would have been called a bonus bill to pay relief checks to them during the Depression. And then when they didn't get that, they remained for purposes that were unclear. And they organized themselves, they drilled, they demonstrated on a regular basis, right? They had established a couple of tent cities that were fairly elaborate, and nobody knew what they were going to do. They had their own newspaper. Their self-appointed leader regarded himself as somebody in the mold of Hitler and Mussolini and wanted to establish a khaki shirt movement that would be analogous to the brown shirts or the black shirts. Meanwhile, you know, President Hoover thought of them as clearly a communist threat. For no other reason, I think, than they were there and they were an irritant to him, and therefore they must be communists. Not to put too fine a point on them, on it. And as you say, Hoover called out Doug MacArthur and the army to run them off, and they used tanks and tear gas and cavalry under George Patton. There were a lot of illustrious names involved in this rather shameful exercise, and they were succeeded in driving them off, and MacArthur actually exceeded his brief, defied orders to do this, claiming that this was good because, you know, these were obviously radicals who were bent on overthrowing the government. So as I say, Hoover thought of them as a communist threat. Roosevelt looked at this episode and saw that threat to democracy that we were talking about, right? He saw the sort of the two possible avenues by which fascism might come to the United States. Either, you know, sort of from a ground up, grassroots up version, like the bonus army organizing and being taken in an unsavory direction by a charismatic leader, like a Huey Long of that era, or by a overzealous general empowered to put down what was perceived as a communist insurrection. Roosevelt understood that as this inchoate threat that might well turn into a fascist threat, one that he deliberately sought to defuse in early 1933, when a small bonus march returned to Washington. As you probably know, he sent out Eleanor to meet them and to,
right.
you know, chat with them, and also offered them a special selection of places in the Civilian Conservation Corps that would be set aside for veterans, some thousands of which they took, right? The formerly proto-fascist leader of the bonus army said he didn't need to protest anymore because clearly the New Deal was giving veterans what they needed. So that's what I mean when I say the New Deal was understood by many people, including most importantly Roosevelt, as a program to defuse a anti-democratic threat to the United States government.
Yeah, it's really a great point. I hope this takes root in the historiography of the New Deal, the anti-fascist democratic impact of it beyond things that are so elusive today, like infrastructure. In fact, I mean, looking back at the 19th century, where I do my research, infrastructure is always an elusive thing in this country. It never gets the kind of support you'd think people would. And you know, I think of Joe Manchin often and how his predecessor Robert Byrd was smart enough in terms of infrastructure to attract as much money as he could to that state. If you'd visit there today, as I have, almost every road and highway and bridge is named for Robert Byrd or his family. And you know, I keep thinking that Manchin could get a bridge or two if he got it in that manner. But one more pre-New Deal question, because I have to ask this. This story is deeply embedded in Roosevelt House mythology. And I think from our few minutes together, I have a terrible feeling that you're going to burst the bubble a little. So our story goes that New York State Secretary of Labor and good friend of Eleanor, Frances Perkins, arrived at Roosevelt House on February 5th, 1933. I remember that date because it's my birthday. Not my actual birth date, but my birthday. And entered the library on invitation to be considered as the first woman to join the presidential cabinet. And that she thereupon, instead of being interviewed for the job, set her prerequisites for accepting, which included old age pensions, minimum wage, maximum hours, and child labor laws. I know you think that it was sort of already understood by mutual understanding, not to be redundant, that these were Roosevelt's priorities as well. So may we keep telling that story, or you think it's a little bit overdone?
I'm not going to stop you from telling your favorite story, Harold. I think that, I mean, it's certainly true that Frances Perkins was a vital figure in pressing for those policies and in shaping those policies as they were implemented through the New Deal. I think you wouldn't want to attribute them to Perkins solely. I think the important thing to point out is that the reason Perkins was there, and in fact, the reasons Perkins was before that state commissioner of labor, was because other women activists, most notably Molly Dewson, right, had put her there because this was their agenda, right? This was a progressive agenda that came out of the early 20th century that Eleanor supported, that Perkins supported, yes, that Molly Dewson supported, and that a variety of settlement house workers had been pressing for decades. And Dewson was a formidable politician. She was much admired by Louis Howe, among others, for her abilities simply as sort of grassroots politics. One of the things she did in her work for the Democratic National Committee was to design a series of flyers in the 1932 campaign that would promise a bunch of policies, including the ones you're describing. I mean, this is the thing, is Roosevelt campaigned on those policies, right? He gave a speech during the campaign in which he described his agenda as one of social justice. I mean, he used those words to describe these kinds of policies. They were policies he had pressed for as governor and which reflected his actual program as governor. So it wouldn't have been news to him that Frances Perkins wanted these policies to be part of his administration. I mean, even if you think he was solely a figurehead, you know, when he gave those speeches, the words came out of his mouth. So he was aware of these priorities. But it's certainly absolutely important that Perkins does get appointed at Dewson's behest and does become a vital figure in the administration for that side of the New Deal.
I feel you've given me, if not a blessing, at least a pass on this story for future use. It was a great collaboration.
I try to be a gracious guest, Harold.
Of course, organized labor hated her, so it was a sort of a fascinating hire.
Well, here's the Secretary of Labor, and she's not a unionist, you know.
Yeah.
It doesn't come out of the trades union.
Right. I want to talk about two chapters in the book because I was just particularly struck by them among all of the wonderful chapters. As you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, Eric takes us from city to city, town to town, to behold a manifestation of the New Deal, which is his wedge, his entry point into a broader discussion in each of these chapters. I think it's just done brilliantly. But I was struck, well, by all of them. I want to talk about the Tennessee Valley Authority chapter because you can almost hear the river rippling and the fish swimming and the anglers wading through, not knowing that all of this lushness and so-called naturalness was created by Roosevelt's infrastructure projects. Tell us a little bit about that innovation. And of course, Roosevelt's genius in not making it just an urban New Deal public works policy, but also briefly, because we're also in an era of court challenges to programs. How on earth some of these programs, like Tennessee Valley Authority, survived all of the court challenges, indeed the court rollbacks that other New Deal programs faced? That's a big question. Sorry.
It is. Well, the TVA is so named because it's the Tennessee River, not the state of Tennessee, right? And the Tennessee River runs through a handful of states, sort of in the middle part of the eastern half of the country there. So it's a long river, and it was at the time a river that was prone to flooding, and that was pulling away a lot of the fertile soil of the region and making it less suitable for agriculture. It was a region that was among the poorest in the country. And so Roosevelt, from the very beginning, with the support of a variety of Congresspeople, most notably the liberal Republican senator from Nebraska, George Norris, right, wanted to create a multi-state unit, right, that would think in terms of the natural landscape. In this case, the river had a watershed. And so they were thinking in terms of sort of natural boundaries rather than in terms of states or localities that were the traditional divisions of American politics. And what they were going to do was recreate this region using, most notably, of course, the spectacular dams that are now its most visible feature, but also, as you say, just sort of curating the landscape more generally, right? Providing fertilizer and new agricultural techniques to prevent erosion, also making the rivers more navigable to promote new kinds of industry in the region and commerce in and out of the region, to have, along with the fertilizer and these agricultural program, outreach programs to the farmers in the region, and in generally to sort of reshape the Tennessee River Valley as a more prosperous, more self-governing, and more economically vital region. The dams, as I say, were only the biggest and most obvious blunt instrument of that. They would, of course, generate electricity that would then be distributed by cooperatives within the region at a price that would show what a fair price of a kilowatt would be to the private monopolies in the area. So that's where, as you say, it gets over into something that posed a challenge also to the powers that were at the time. It's hard to overstate, the ambition of the TVA. And one of the tools that I tried to use to draw this out in the book was the reporter Ernie Pyle, who would later be famous for his war reporting, right, visited Norris Dam when it was still under construction on the Clinch River, which is one of the tributaries to the Tennessee, and is one of the earliest sites where they did new construction under the Tennessee River Valley. And Pyle just sort of marvels at the scope of what in such a short time, right, the New Deal has brought to this poverty-struck region and what it plans to do in the future. Now, a couple things are worth pointing out here. First of all, the Tennessee River Valley is, of course, in the South. It is the birthplace of the original Ku Klux Klan. The Democratic Party there had the racial politics that we previously alluded to. There was segregation in the Tennessee Valley Works, and there was segregation in the programs that it put forward. So it fell short of a New Deal ideal in those ways, and I talked about how Black journalists and writers thought of that at the time, the mixed feelings that they had about the Tennessee Valley, where Black people did have jobs, but also didn't have the opportunities that they should have had. But also, the fact that it posed a challenge to the private monopolies meant that they were going to try to hold it up in court, which they did, right? And that's one of the things that prevented the TVA from becoming a model for a more ambitious rethinking of the whole country's energy infrastructure, which is what Roosevelt wanted it to be. Because they said, well, there's no point in pressing forward with this if the Supreme Court is going to strike it down. And in fact, the Supreme Court did strike down sort of one New Deal program after another. In the end, it upheld the TVA because improving the navigability of rivers goes right to interstate commerce, which is a core function of the federal government in the Constitution. Moreover, manufacturing phosphates, which could be used for explosives, was a national defense program, right? So it skated through in a way that some New Deal programs didn't. But that specter of sort of monopolist opposition and big business using the courts to press back against a program like this is one of the things that limited, right, the TVA in its scope. So it's both an illustration of the ambition of the New Deal, the way that the original New Deal was a Green New Deal, to use a phrase that we could think of today, in its way that it tried to make a more sustainable sort of impact on the landscape. and also the ways in which those ambitions were thwarted and why we have to revisit them.
I'm being nudged to ask for questions from the audience, but I have one more
Okay.
question I must ask. Because the chapter that I learned the most from, I suppose I've been the most ignorant about, was the so-called Indian New Deal and John Collier. Just tell us as concisely as you can and still have it make sense for us, because I knew very little about this. What was the Indian New Deal? And does it show the inadequacy of some New Deal programs, or actually in empowering communities? Was it a harbinger of a kind of a woke New Deal?
As you might have suspected, I'm going to say it was both, right? I think that this is another area in which the New Deal was massively ambitious and idealistic and fell short of its ambitions, right? The 19th century policy of the federal government for the West, and particularly the arid West, had been to give away land, whether it was via the homestead policies or by dividing up the native nations and giving their land away piecemeal. And the New Deal reversed both those policies, instead operating on a more sort of ecologically minded planning view of how to use the land to try to keep it from eroding or being squandered in the way that they saw that it had been done down into the Great Depression. And Collier was one of these people. He was, in many respects, quite progressive for his day. He is the rare bureaucrat who wanted to give up power for his bureaucracy and to re-empower the native nations to manage their own affairs. And that was the main thrust of the Indian New Deal, as well as, of course, major public works for the Indian populations. There was a special sort of version of the CCC called the Indian Emergency Conservation Work, which did tremendous amounts of infrastructure improvement on native lands. As I say, Collier was both trying to devolve authority and then, like many idealist and ambitious peoples, not quite really willing to give up, on things going his way. And in many cases, most notably in the case of dealing with the Navajos, he butted heads with local leaders and undermined his own project, right? At the same time, the Navajos did gain authority from within, owing to the activism of native peoples, as indeed did many other native nations, taking the charters that the Indian New Deal allowed them to craft and then using them for their own purposes going forward. So there are many impacts of the New Deal in the land, including in the arid West, and on native nations is one of the places where you can view, again, it's sort of, I would say, large but incomplete legacy of democratization and empowerment of these communities.
Thank you, Eric. And with that, I'm going to invite Mac to moderate the Q&A.
Hello to you both. This has been great. First, a comment from Sarah Peskin, who is the board chair of the Frances Perkins Center. She says that she stands by our story, Harold, so that's good news. And she also says that we might want to remind people that Frances Perkins also prioritized public works, i.e. infrastructure, among her list for FDR in her interview. And she compliments the book. So a question from Carol Gutman. Carol says she cannot think of another nation which even attempted to copy, much less achieve, its own New Deal. Is that so? If so, how do we explain such a lack of imitation or inspiration?
Well, I think you can point to ways that the New Deal was part of a larger framework of what in Western Europe is called social democracy, right? So if you look at the establishment, for example, of the Beveridge program in Britain after the war, this is of a piece with many of the Perkins-esque policies of the New Deal, as we are calling them this evening, I see. So that I think that you can say that the New Deal definitely belongs as part and parcel of those social democratic movements in Western Europe after the war. So I wouldn't make a sort of a rigid distinction between the New Deal and what other countries do. It's also worth pointing out that At various times, other countries have taken up the inspiration of the New Deal. And in fact, as far as I know, the original call for a Green New Deal actually came from the United Nations or a United Nations committee. And it's been used by British intellectuals and writers, including Anne Pettifor, in recent years. So it does serve as an inspiration. It was especially notably of influence on the British government of Gordon Brown in the 21st century. So it has had its international impact, maybe more concretely, again, not metaphorically, but actually. In the years after the war, there were a number of nations who sought to imitate the Tennessee Valley Authority or aspects of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and which had loans from the World Bank to do so, the World Bank being, I would argue, a late and internationally minded New Deal institution. So I think the New Deal does have a bit of international impact that's worth pointing out.
Great. C asks, of the 4 FDR elections, which one had the largest win and which had the most positive press coverage?
The largest win is 1936, right? Hands down. It's the enormous landslide, both popularly and in the Electoral College, as the Dean of New Deal historians, William Leuchtenberg, likes to point out. It's the biggest presidential win since James Monroe won essentially unopposed. So that's the big one, right? Is the 1936 election, where Roosevelt is running on the success of the New Deal and wins a ratification of his program because, in large measure, it's successful, again, in promoting economic recovery in many parts of the United States. Favorable press coverage, boy, as we were just saying during the conversation before, Roosevelt doesn't get a lot of favorable press coverage from the major papers at the time, right? And it's certainly not going to be 1940, where he's being vilified for his interventionist agenda coming into the war. So, I mean, at a guess, I would say it would have to be 44, but I really, really couldn't say for sure.
I'll just throw in that when we talk about traditional press coverage, I mean, he makes news the way his cousin Theodore did, to go beyond the editorial biases of the majority Republican ownership of newspapers. But don't forget, Roosevelt is meanwhile conquering new media, as the great communicators often do, radio and newsreels. He is omnipresent, even though there are only 28 fireside chats. First one, which is not even counted in the list, at Roosevelt House, I will say, on the day after the election, 1932. But he's on the radio all the time, and he's in newsreels every week. So he's finding a way to create his own press without the interference of pesky middlemen like newspapers.
Okay, a question from Jim Pichinich. Jim says, for those people who lost faith in the democratic form of government, did the appeal of other forms of government, such as communism, increase?
There was an American Communist Party at this point. It wasn't especially huge, but it was big, and there was also an American Socialist Party at this point, which was headed by Norman Thomas. And despite the rhetoric of folks like Herbert Hoover, for example, they felt that Roosevelt wasn't really doing what they would have liked. In fact, Thomas was asked once notably by a reporter, isn't President Roosevelt simply carrying out your agenda? And Thomas said, yes, on a stretcher, right? That they thought that the New Deal was sort of sapping the vitality of left alternatives. And that would have been true until you get into the the Popular Front and more interventionist eras of communism, which then turns on a dime with the Nazi-Soviet pact. What Roosevelt was much more worried about, which his advisors like Robert Jackson point out, really worried him in a way that leftist politics never did, was authoritarian or fascist alternatives. Roosevelt really did worry about the influence of Nazi Germany internationally and in the United States, and also of homegrown fascist movements, of which there were many, not least, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, but also novel movements like the movement of Charles Coughlin, the so-called radio priest, which was overtly fascistic and anti-Semitic by the end of the decade, or many others that you probably have forgotten about by now, like the Silver Shirts of William Pelly and any number of fascist or proto-fascist organizations. Those were the things that really gave Roosevelt pause.
Okay. John asks, did the 1936 victory feed a hubris in FDR, which led him to take on the Supreme Court later?
That's a big question. I think that, he failed, right, in getting the court packed. So that's the main takeaway people have from that episode, and that's why we might say that it was hubris that led him to do it. On the other hand, he came within an ace of succeeding. Right? It was nearly passed on a couple of occasions, and it might well have gone through had not his floor leader in Congress, Joseph Robinson, literally dropped dead right in the middle of a critical phase of the campaign. So given as close as he came, I'm not sure that we know that it was hubris. Moreover, from very early on in the campaign to reform the judiciary, folks within the Roosevelt administration were saying that even if we don't get it, it might influence the justices to make some different kinds of rulings. And many historians have argued that that is in fact what happened. So I'm not sure we would say, therefore, that it was necessarily hubris. It might have been a costly play, certainly, but maybe not necessarily one that was unsuccessful altogether.
Okay, I think I've got one more. I think this is a good one to finish with. An anonymous questioner asks, were the programs and initiatives of the New Deal conceived as a large-scale corrective to the Great Depression, or were they intended to be permanent features of American federal government apparatus going forward?
Well, Roosevelt and his closest advisors really did think of them as permanent solutions to permanent problems, that they thought that Roosevelt said things like, we cannot go back to the good old days. In fact, I have my doubts as to how good the good old days were. We must move forward to new and better days, right? They thought of things like the Works Progress Administration in terms of, as I've said, a jobs guarantee, as we would now say. And in fact, Roosevelt campaigned on that in 1932, saying that the federal government must always be the last-ditch employer of Americans, the employer of last resort for Americans, ensuring that we don't have massive unemployment of the kind that, of course, they then saw in 1932. That agenda, was eclipsed by the war and was set aside with Roosevelt's death, and the Truman administration moved on to other priorities. Not wholly without trying. The story of how we ended up with the Council of Economic Advisors is the story of how the Truman administration ultimately failed to get a more robust program for full employment, right? But the original ambition was for a more fully equitable, or as Roosevelt would have said, socially just set of economic policies. And you can see that still remained his priority if you look at his speeches during the war, including most notably, of course, the so-called Second Bill of Rights speech.
That's great. Well, thank you, Mr. Rochefort. Thank you, Harold. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Eric, you're
Is that
first.
for me or for Harold?
You go first.
Well, again, what I'm struck by when I revisit the Roosevelt era is how he thought of the New Deal really as a rescue program for American democracy, for not only bringing it off of its sickbed, but also for rehabilitating it so that it could move forward in greater and more robust health with the time of the Depression being past. And we did hear the president invoke that just a few weeks or months ago. Time passes very rapidly these days, but quite recently, the current president did invoke Roosevelt with that thought of trying to reinvigorate American democracy, which was heartening. And I certainly hope we will see and hear more of that.
I would just add to that how wonderful it's been to be in conversation with you this evening. And if you ask me what I've learned in terms of how to answer the question, why the New Deal matters, ... its relevance for now, I would say that, Eric, you've shown us that improving the economy enhances democracy, and conversely, enhancing democracy improves the economy. So thank you for the lesson you've taught us, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, and I appreciate your having me.
Okay. Thank you both. Good night.